Hey everyone, Mulligan here with the Great Parliament, and welcome to the Fall of Argenport Legendary Crafting Guide. This guide is to help new players looking to get into competitive play and want to know what legendaries are worth crafting from this set. Since this video only focuses on Fall of Argenport legendaries, it won't be split up into factions like previous guides I've done. I'll go fairly in depth for each card in this video and how they're used in order to help new players that want to focus on crafting legendaries for a specific deck. This video is split up into essential legendaries, which are necessary in at least one deck, and then optional legendaries, which are cards that occasionally find their way into some decks, but typically aren't necessary for those decks. Any legendary I don't mention is either highly experimental, doesn't fit the general game plan of the popular decks you would see, or is just plain bad. Let's get started. So starting with the essential legendaries, first up is Teacher of Humility. This is a 2-power 3/3 unit requiring 2-time influence to play. She has Infiltrate, where when she hits the enemy player, you play a disciplinary weights on the enemy player, and then each player draws a card. Even after the recent nerf to disciplinary weights, I think it's still safe to say that this card is an essential 4 of in nearly every time mid-range deck out there. A 2-power 3/3 with upside is just incredible, especially since time mid-range decks are built to have double time influence in the early game anyway. A Teacher might still be considered a push card even with the weights change, but we've had push cards in the past. I've only seen one time mid-range deck that doesn't use Teacher, and that's Big Elysian, due to running cards like Hailstorm and Power Stone main deck. Outside of that, if you plan to build time mid-range, you absolutely want 4 copies of these. Next up is End of the Story, a 6-power spell needing 2 Justice Influence to play. It has Warp, you kill all units. It also has Tribute, where End of the Story can't be negated or blocked by Aegis. This will be controversial for some, but I think it's just safe enough to say this is an essential legendary for certain decks. Justice-based control decks already have Harsh Rule, but some of those decks can usually afford to run End of the Story as well. Why? Because those decks typically run a single copy of this card in their market, if nowhere else. In particular, these are Huru-based control decks that have a tough time popping Aegis outside of using stuff like Unstable Form. Decks like Justice Primal Shadow Control and Chalice Control decks run this card. Not so much Acharya control decks, although some do run it there as well. In the market, this does a pretty good job of acting as a 5th Harsh Rule. It's certainly better than that other card we got in Omens of the Past. Next is End of Hostilities, a 6-power spell needing 2 Primal Influence to play. It has Warp, you play a copy of a unit, and if Tribute was activated, you play 2 copies instead. This is a case of a card that's only essential in one deck and nowhere else in the current meta, that deck being Kenedans. This is one of the big payoff cards for that deck since you use Combustion Cell to sacrifice one of your Grenadins to gain extra power and ramp into either playing Kenna herself or playing End of Hostilities on a Kenna you already have on board, with Tribute being activated in either scenario thanks to Combustion Cell. Targeting your opponent's best unit with Tribute activated on Hostilities is also fairly common. If you're building Kenedans specifically, you'll need 4 copies of these. Next is Kenna Shaman of the Scale, a 7-power 5/6 unit needing 3 Primal Influence to play. She has Killer. When you play a spell, Kenna gets +2/+2 and flying this turn, and if Tribute was activated when she's played, you draw a spell from your void. This is the other essential piece to the Kenedans puzzle, and where the deck gets its namesake. I won't go into much more detail than what I've already said when I talked about End of Hostilities. Just know that the play patterns are largely the same with Kenna. She's the other payoff card for playing Kenedans along with End of Hostilities. I will say, however, that on her own, she's still a decent 7-drop. She's no Acharya by any means, but at least you get some immediate value out of her with Killer. It's possible she might see play in other decks in the future, but for now, if you're building Kenedans, 4 copies of her is essential. Up next is Rizan, Great Bowmaster, a 6-power 5/4 unit needing 2 Fire and 2 Justice Influence to play. He has Flying and Reckless. He also gains Lifesteal while you have 3 or more spells in your void. And when he comes into play, you deal 3 damage to an enemy. I think at this point, Rezon has silenced the doubters. Now the only debate is on how to pronounce this guy's name. Jokes aside though, Rezon is absolutely essential in just about every deck that runs Acharya. Rakano Valkyries, Acharya Black, Acharya Blue, you name it. Rezon can just provide a huge tempo swing and bait out removal to make your Acharya even harder to deal with. And the quote-unquote drawback of having Reckless is negated by the flying tag. The lifesteal is just a cherry on top, but it does help you come back from behind against aggro decks. He's just insanely good at what he does. The only Acharya deck that doesn't play Rezon is Charge Rod. If you're building any of the other Acharya decks I mentioned earlier though, you need 4 copies of this guy. Next is Sword of Unity, a 4-power 2/2 weapon requiring 2 time and 2 justice influence to play. The user gains lifesteal and overwhelm, and this has Spellcraft 2 where you play a stand together. More and more players have realized how strong this card can be. This is clearly the best Spellcraft weapon in Fall of Argenport, which makes sense given that it's a legendary. Despite that, I was personally still skeptical, but not anymore. In Combre aggro decks, even playing this on turn 4 is solid. Playing it on turn 6 is just a way to spend your extra power. This also started finding its way into Alessi decks, but with the nerf to safe return, the deck is seeing less play right now. It's starting to find its way into higher curve decks like Big Combre, but it's become a mainstay in Combre aggro. I'd say if you're building Combre aggro, you want 4 copies of these, but you shouldn't feel bad about crafting these in general. Unless you're not building a Combre deck, of course. Last but certainly not least for the essential legendaries is Surso's Cleaver. This is a 5-power 3/3 weapon needing 1 time, 1 primal, and 1 shadow influence to play. When you equip this on a unit, the wielder gets Killer, and this also has Spellcraft where you can pay 2 additional power and you can play a feeding time. This one is probably going to be controversial for some. I wasn't sure myself if Cleaver could be considered essential, but there is one deck that uses this card, and that's what's come to be known as Surso's Feast. It's a time primal shadow midrange deck that Manues put together, which if I recall correctly was based on an earlier build by a player that goes by the name Phyrexican. If End of Hostilities and Kenna, cards that are only played in one deck currently, are good enough to be considered essential legendaries, then I think this is as well, without the slope getting slippery. However, similar to those 2 legendaries, this is almost exclusively played in Surso's Feast. You'll need 4 copies of these, but only if you're building towards that deck. Moving on to the optional legendaries, the first on this list is Jawbone Greatsword. This is a 4-power 5/2 relic weapon, needing 2 fire influence to play. If Tribute is activated, you create and draw an 8/6 brand without fear. This is starting to find a home in some variants of Grenadin decks. The deck it's seen the most in is Stonescar Grenadins, along with Jag Lonegun, which I'll touch on later in the video, and it's also seen in some Kenadin lists. Basically, it's being tried in any deck that runs Combustion Cell because that card is the easiest way to activate Tribute in the game so far. However, when this card is in a deck list, it's usually in the market and not so much in the main deck. And there are still some Grenadin lists not running this card at all. Stonescar Midrange plays multiple copies of this card main deck, but the deck hasn't been very strong up to this point. For Grenadins, you can probably just get away with crafting a single copy for your market, maybe up to 3 copies for other decks. It's not a bad card by any means, but it's definitely not a core card in any deck right now. Up next is Alhed Mountbreaker, a 5-power 6/6 unit needing 2 time influence to play. He has Inspire, where you double the strength and health of units you draw, and an ultimate where you can pay 4 and put one of your other units on top of your deck to give Alhed its strength and health. This is a card that actually has the potential to become essential in certain time decks. The effect is very powerful, even if you have a minimum amount of card draw. But currently, not every time midrange deck runs this card. Alhed is usually seen together with Worldbearer Behemoth, but Alhed also faces competition from Behemoth, because it has some evasion with overwhelm and has higher health. I've seen lists run between 2 to 4 copies of this card, if they run it at all. But again, Owlhead isn't currently a priority over other time legendaries, like the behemoth I mentioned earlier, among others. Next we have Thundering Karras, a 6 power 8/8 unit requiring 4-time influence to play. It has overwhelm, and when either player plays a spell, the other player draws a card. A card I personally like and feel is a little underrated. Karras is pretty annoying to deal with once it comes down, even if you don't run that many spells. That's usually because you'll need a spell to kill it, since an 8/8 for 6 power is just too big for most other units to fight in most decks, and the time decks that run Karras don't have many spells themselves. So Karras usually gets the wielder some value. Despite all that, Karras has been met with mixed opinions, and you don't see it in every time mid-range deck. Predatory Carnosaur also gives it competition. So sad to say, this isn't essential legendary status right now. There's other cards that take priority as far as what to craft first. And like Owlhead, most of them aren't in this video. When I do see it in decks, Karras is usually run at 2 or 3 copies. And last but certainly not least, we have Jek Lonegun, a 6 power 7/7 needing 2 fire and 2 shadow influence to play. He has deadly, and when a unit goes to the enemy void, it gets void bound. If tribute is activated when Jek hits play, you kill an enemy unit. And Jek has infiltrate, where you create and draw bad news if he hits the enemy player. One of my personal favorites from this set. Sadly though, this version of Jek isn't really essential in any deck right now. Like Jawbone Greatsword, this sees play in Stonescar Grenadin decks, but most of the time he's relegated to the market. It's just incredibly hard to activate tribute outside a combustion cell. If Stonescar midrange gets its act together, I could see this being an essential 4 in that deck. Until then, you don't really need this guy, and can safely craft a single copy for your Stonescar Grenadin's market, if that's what you want to try. That's it for the Fall of Argenport Legendary Crafting Guide. Hopefully I've pointed you in the right direction if you're just starting out. If you liked the video, feel free to give it a like. As always, if you have any suggestions or just general feedback, let me know in the comments section below. Also, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the future videos, not just for this series, but for the other Eternal content I put out as well. Thanks for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.